Welcome back, everyone, for another episode of the Veterinary AI Brief. I am your co-host, Robert, joined by Adam and Aaron. And we have some pretty incredible topics to invite you along on the ride with today. There have been some very interesting studies that have appeared recently that ladder up to this idea of how is AI affecting clinical performance very, very directly. And there have also been, releases by the models that mean building is getting a lot easier for, the quote unquote non-technical crowd. And we're going to talk about, maybe even briefly a hackathon that Anthropic had where they found that the winners weren't actually software engineers. Software engineers competed, but professionals who understood their domain actually built something more stable. Before we get to all of that, though, there was a really interesting paper. It's called the MASAI trial. This was published in Lancet. And basically, this was a randomly controlled trial, the first of its kind. They took 105,000 women in Sweden, and they tried to measure basically the impact of AI supported mammography screening compared to performance from like two oncologists looking at the scans together. And what they found was really striking. So basically, the oncologist that was teamed up with AI caught 29% more cancers than the double oncologist approach took. So it took sensitivity from 73.8% all the way up to 80.5%. There were no increases in false positives. So like that's the other thing. The question would be, okay, you're catching more, but is there more noise? It found no. Like it was as the double oncologist approach. And it cut the workload of the, I'm sorry, radiologists, not oncologists. It cut the workload of radiologists by, I believe it was 44%. So not only is performance improved, but the per unit of productivity is also significantly improved. So why does this matter? Well, this was the actual first kind of gold standard research done about the impact of AI, at least in assisting diagnostics in human health at this scale. And so they proved that it works better than the standard, at least in this specific case for this type of cancer within the clinical workflow. Now, the obvious question that I want to bring my co-hosts into now is like, what does this mean for veterinary medicine, right? How generalizable is this to veterinary medicine? How many, this was for, mammography screening. Is this if it's generalizable to veterinary medicine, how generalizable is it to, other types of cancers? And what is the kind of blast radius for us? How do we think about this affecting actual clinical day-to-day workflows? And so, what we did after we talked internally, the three of us, about this paper is we reached out to Dr. Tam, who is at Colorado State University. He is the president of the Veterinary Cancer Society. He's the editor-in-chief of Veterinary and Comparative Oncology. He led the VACCS canine cancer vaccine trial with groundbreaking discoveries there. He might be the best dude to talk to about this. And he was very generous to respond to, a cold email by me and offer his time to talk through the study with us. And we want to kind of bring what his insights were to you, the audience here, because I think it's super interesting. The biggest takeaway that he had is apples and oranges. Like, you're not going to be able to just kind of pipe in the results to veterinary medicine and say, "Okay, there's this new unlock. Everyone needs to be doing things this way," because we don't screen for cancer this way in animal health, right? We don't just like proactively screen and with high throughput and look for, specific types of cancers if we don't have a reason. But he said something very interesting. He was chewing on this for a little while before we talked, and he said, what this could probably be applicable for is looking for evidence of early metastasis within the lungs, which is something that, we have to do all the time. I'm speaking, we as an oncologist, radiologist, certainly not me as the only person on the call who doesn't have a doctorate by his name. And so he said, like, the really interesting thing would be if we figured out a way to kind of categorize this data. And then this data does exist. Like, there are organizations that have access to this, and we could figure out, like, could we develop an AI system that could provide clinical support, where we would know more, like, have a higher degree of, sensitivity, basically, to catching these cancers. And he said, basically, even for a radiologist, it's very difficult to know, like, a spot on the lungs, is that cancer? Is that age related? And there's just so much that we're not privy to right now that's causing us to guess more than anything else. So I think this is super fascinating. It is a completely new way of thinking for the industry that we think probably deserves some attention. As the, again, only non doctor on this show, I've about reached the limits of my fairway to comment on this. So I'd love to chat through this with the co-host now. And Adam, I know you've been chewing on this for a while too. What does this make you thinking? Like, what's the connective tissue, and what does the audience need to be internalizing right now?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple buckets that are worth unpacking. So I think two things can be true at once. One is that you're going to see examples like this Lancet paper where AI is able to outperform humans in this specific task, in this specific situation, with these specific models. That does not necessarily mean, in many cases, it doesn't mean that it's kind of at a point where it can be used more broadly in different situations or with different clinical conditions. I think this sort of jaggedness can be really challenging for people to wrap their heads around because, and we see this all the time, AI is great at something that is almost awe-inspiring. Like you look at like the math Olympiad performances of the updated models, yet, it can't reliably count to 200 right now if you ask it. And so that's really difficult because it's easy to look at a study like that Lancet one and say, oh, we're going to transform all of cancer like tomorrow, as opposed to, I think, where this is really helpful, which is taking these specific problems where there's a known process that has known limitations, either the accessibility, the time, the accuracy, and sort of applying AI to that problem. So that's one piece there. The second is, I think the rigor around these sorts of studies will continue to get dialed up as AI starts to permeate more areas of medicine. And I think that's actually like a really helpful, good thing. We'll get into this a little bit later on, but I think building trust with the medical community in order to use these tools is going to be a really important challenge that both the kind of hyperscalers and the more kind of generalized model providers will face, but also these kind of more vertical applications. And we can talk more about the veterinary specific ones. So I think that's another important piece, right? You have the jaggedness, don't overgeneralize this. The second is this research sort of sets the foundation or the framework of how we could approach that research for other conditions. And then I think the third part is, and this is something that, Dr. Ryan Appleby shared in his episode, there's a lot more value that can be brought via AI than just accuracy, right? So you talked about kind of the workflow improvements and the time, the reallocation of time. I think that this is something where as AI begins to augment the entire process, there are aspects of, let's say, like the diagnostic journey that lend itself to being more heavily augmented or automated as a result of AI beyond just the diagnosis itself. And things like gathering the history or writing the report or providing interfaces for people to interrogate those findings or ask questions and follow-up care. There just seems to be so much more surface area for AI to support people than just like what is that final diagnosis. And so I think those are a few buckets that kind of jump out to me. But I think what's going to happen is you're going to start to see a much different research cadence around the use of AI in medicine because of the improvements of models and because of the diffusion of these capabilities, both within medical communities, but also, patients and clients. And I think that we need a research muscle that evolves as quickly as the models get released. And that is incredibly challenging when most papers take months, if not years, to go from kind of idea all the way to publishing. So those are just kind of a few thoughts that jump out. What do you think, Eric?
But I started like trying to understand why exactly are we talking about this now if it's like 3 years later. So why is it that this thing was published? And yet it's because now it's at the implementation phase. And so now people are paying more attention to these kinds of studies because they're thinking about how do we bring them into practice.
I think that made this one particularly unique was the randomized kind of clinical trial method, right? And the idea of basically taking these portions and diverting them through this kind of AI-led pathway versus the more traditional double oncologist review.
So I think this paper, the one that was published in January, is really interesting, and it points to a few different things that we've talked about before, right? So anytime that, and Adam, you were just mentioning this, like anytime that we have studies that are done, they're usually multiple years in the past. So they're relying on technologies that are at least a year, if not two, maybe even 3 years old, because often what they do when they're writing these papers is that they control the environment. So anytime that there's a model update, they would not use the latest model in order to then validate any results that they have. And so I think that that's just one thing to keep in mind is that this work is probably a couple of years old, if not older than that. And so some of the results that we're seeing might not be as good as if they were done today, but there's this publishing lag that exists. And I think the fastest turnaround that I've seen from the majority of publications is about a year from when the paper is submitted to when the paper is actually published. And so we're always like, it's always a little bit behind. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind. The other thing that is coming out of this, from my understanding, is that AI, although we immediately jump to this idea that it will be diagnosing better than humans, what we're finding is that there's this gradation that exists in between no AI and full AI diagnosing everything that's happening. And this is one of those examples, right? Where it is actually helping with the workload, it is helping with the clinicians, it's helping. And so I think a lot of people see AI in this, you know, kind of Terminator version of it's coming to take our jobs and all that kind of stuff. But there's all of these steps along the way that keep demonstrating very clearly that AI has a place in the workflow of practicing veterinarians, practicing clinicians more broadly all along. And so if it's helping, for example, I remember a conversation a couple of years ago with radiologists, and they were saying, look, if we go on to and fully engage this idea of AI diagnosing all of these different cases, we just don't have the body of literature that's going to support that. But what it can do is help us write reports faster. And that's what we're seeing. So AI scribing is helping people write reports faster, which is then getting more standardized data sets, which is then allowing for a greater likelihood of AI being able to diagnose more and more. But in the meantime, it's just helping reduce the workload, and in particular, the administrative workload of a lot of people. And it seems like these kinds of papers just keep pointing in that direction, that we're chipping away at the workflow, making things easier. And at every single point, there's an opportunity for a veterinarian to elevate the role that they play so that they are not filling out forms, but they're using their clinical decision making and leveraging AI in order to provide the fastest turnaround times with the best possible results. I think that's the take home message for me from these papers.
The other thing that you raised that I think is really important to sort of note is, and this is kind of a framing that I think is going to be important for people as there's more headlines about AI, displacing, taking jobs, etc. It's not, I don't look at it from a jobs perspective, look at it from like a task perspective. And one of the things that makes, I think, veterinary medicine particularly resilient is that veterinarians and veterinary teams do a diversity of tasks. They do tasks in person, they do tasks on computers, they do tasks be in front, client facing, in the back office, etc. And so there are some of those tasks that AI is going to be in a position to do incredibly well. But veterinary medicine is probably the least, unitask job that there is on the planet. And so I think that brings with it a lot of resiliency in the world of AI, but it means that we are going to have to think differently and sort of shift the allocation of time towards different tasks as AI becomes more and more common. I think one of the things that you're seeing with scribes as an interesting kind of leading indicator here is that the task of writing a medical record is something that veterinarians will probably not do in the future. AI is going to do that. Now, a new task is created, which is overseeing and sort of managing the output. And it turns out for a lot of veterinarians, what we're finding is that even if they're not sort of saving that time in the way that they would have liked, or the way that the theoretical time savings, they prefer the task of overseeing, editing, and managing the medical record as opposed to being the one drafting it. And to be fair, we've known that all along because we've had humans that have been literally scribes in appointment rooms in medicine for decades, right? And so I think that this is a good example where when you see headlines, AI better than radiologists, it's really like, what is the dimension of the job? What is the task that AI is actually better at, under what conditions and what situations? And that is not generalizable to everything else. And I think this is where you see some of the tension with the academic and sort of specialist boards, where they get particularly frustrated and concerned when AI is overgeneralized in a field that they know to be much more complex, with real patient and health outcomes, where there is no regulatory harness to protect against that. And maybe kind of shifting a little bit gears to one of the maybe the yin and yang of the power of AI. This past week, we got our first research on the impact of ChatGPT health that I'll throw up in a second. But if you look at the Lancet study that we was talking about, like the power of AI and the success of AI and the accuracy of AI, what this particular paper showed was that in really emergent situations and not really non-urgent, across the cases that they looked at, ChatGPT health did not perform particularly well. I think in 52% of the cases, it was incorrect in terms of the right level of escalation and triage for what were emergency cases. And so we can talk about that in a second, but I just think you are going to see both things flooding your eyeballs over the next 2 decades, or the next couple of years, which is AI is incredible at this thing and AI is incredibly dangerous at this other thing. And how do we reconcile those as professions? And it turns out both can be true at the same time, depending on all the criteria that we just discussed.
So, Adam, I think what you're pointing to here is just how much nuance there is between like these two worlds of AI is phenomenal. Like everyone needs to race towards adopting it now, to this kind of jagged frontier of like what really are and I think you're totally right to frame like the atomic unit really is the task at the task level. And so we should be critically evaluating like which tasks really are set up to function well with AI. And I think like there are a couple considerations here that, I'd really love to work through with both of you, because I imagine different audience members are working through this as well. So the first one, we had Dr. Andy Rourke on the podcast a little while back, and he brought up this point of like basically a concern over ceding too much control to AI for a number of reasons, right? And I actually think part of what he said was validated by a recent paper that Anthropic put out. So they basically looked at, and this came out just a couple days ago. They called it, I think, the AI Fluency Index. So they took a look at basically comparatively between people who are using AI and people who aren't, like what was the overall change in their ability to perform, internalize, critically evaluate these tasks. And what they actually found is that when AI gives you something very polished, your mind uses this heuristic to kind of shortcut your critical evaluation skills. And so really the danger is if you do outsource a lot of this kind of upstream thinking to AI, and then it packages this all for you in a format that looks complete, people are less likely to use these critical faculties and really figure out like, are there gaps or jumps in the thinking? And so that's just like an interesting danger. And maybe I think the other concern is really more about us just like figuring out how do humans fit in this, and like where are we really positioned going forward, like what is going to get eaten away by the models and what is really like the kind of core value proposition we can bring. But I want to pause there because like I'm curious to hear your thoughts, if we just try to empathize with our audience a little bit, the position that they're in between, like, yeah, I think a lot of people are at the point where we get it. There's clear signal that AI is really elevating capabilities, making us more efficient. But how do we really break it down from like these kind of core fears that might be keeping us from figuring out how to leverage these tools?
Yeah, I can go 2 years ago, walking into a crowded room of veterinarians and asking how many people have used ChatGPT. Almost nothing, right? Like maybe one or two people. And then recently go into a crowded room of vets and ask them how many are using ChatGPT or some form of AI scribe or large language model, whatever it is. And it's like 80 to 90%. It's insane, the turnaround. And the thing that is most concerning for me is the number of people who said before, I will never use it, to the number of people who are today saying things like, it's so good that I don't even need to check anymore. And that's very concerning because, and we've talked about this before on the pod, but AVSB is very clear on this, that ultimately the veterinarian is responsible. And so it will not be the case that the AI is going to be responsible for any sort of medical decision. If somebody goes to a state board, the veterinarian cannot say, well, the AI told me so. So that won't happen as far as I can tell. Although Adam, you'll probably correct me on that. Okay. So the idea that people get consistent results that they are happy with so that they get to the point, and then because of that, they get to a particular point where they don't need to critically evaluate that anymore. That is happening. It's very few and far between, like 1 out of maybe 500 people that I've talked to about this stuff, they're doing that. But the fact is that some people are doing that, and that in and of itself is concerning. But it would be no different than somebody getting a report back from a specialist and the specialist giving a recommendation and them not critically evaluating that recommendation within the context of everything else that they know about the animal. And so this is not different. It's just some people seem to be treating it a little bit different. And so that, what is the word that I'm looking for? The diligence that people have built up over the years of getting points of information and then consolidating that, synthesizing that in order to generate a care plan, that has not changed. It's just we have one new modality that is being exercised. And the idea that people are not critically evaluating it because it seems to be good enough, that's frightening, right? And everyone should be concerned about that. Yeah, those are my thoughts.
I do think this is probably an example where things are likely to change considerably in the next little bit. So you're 100% right that this idea of kind of like trust but verify is something that needs to be baked into people. But I think up until this point, people have sort of looked and said, okay, I have to be the verifier. And I think in the beginning that's going to be true, but long term it might not be for each individual task. So as an example, this kind of concept of like LLM as a judge, being able to have another agent that looks and reviews the output on the rubrics, that's already happening now within coding. So we see this a lot where it's like, okay, I'm going to vibe code something, but there's all these security risks. Well, it turns out that is such a important problem to solve that there's whole new categories of companies that are getting, spun up in order to solve that point. There will be AI solutions for veterinarians that just act as judges. And so ironically enough, it's going to be, hey, we're going to generate this task, we're going to generate this drug dose, but then there'll be another company or a company will deploy another agent that acts as a judge in order to reduce the hallucinations or improve the accuracy. I think the market incentives are such that in a way that unsafe AI will get punished and people just will not vote with their wallets. Now, I think that there's this broader question of to what degree do we sort of outsource our own thinking? And there's different kind of, pieces on the spectrum in terms of how people think about that. And I think that really is the crux maybe of what Andy was sharing, where he's like, okay, even if that all happens, Adam, and even if it's all accurate, do we want a world in which veterinarians are not critically thinking about their cases, and where is that line? And I think what's hard for me is I don't think we necessarily get to choose, right? I think it ends up being that of the individual. I think that the regulatory pressures and the responsibility acts as a forcing function to help create that accountability. I think that will be true. But I was speaking at WBC, and it was a pretty introductory talk about ChatGPT and some of these LLMs, and the amount of people who just have never used anything beyond the free model, never customized it, never had access even to the paid models is remarkable to me. And so you have a bucket of people in that category. And then a Hawaiian veterinarian came up to me afterwards and he said, yeah, I use a custom chat GPT. I take my notes from my scribe and I run it through a chat GPT agent that I've built to create my treatment plan, and it has a bunch of more information. And yeah, that's just how I work through my cases. And so those people are like on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I don't think there's going to be some binary rule that says, okay, this is the way that you have to work, or this is the responsibility you have to take. Because at the end of the day, and this is what AABSB has said, you are responsible for the outcomes of your patients, full stop. And whether it's 20 years ago and you looked at a textbook and you read a passage wrong, you read a drug dose wrong, and you use that dose, you're responsible. 10 years ago, when you were searching on Vin and you made grabbed a response from a specialist that ended up not being appropriate for your case or wasn't exhaustive in the context of your case, and you just sort of used it, you would be responsible. Like, you're going to be responsible. And people's level of kind of critical evaluation, I think, will follow that. I think this is why it's so important to make that case, because I think if we're trying to develop sort of guardrails around a particular use case or a particular model or at a particular period of time, that's just going to get completely steamrolled. I think the defense here is that you're a veterinarian that is credentialed, that has a responsibility and an oath. And if you screw up, regardless of why you screwed up or what information you read, or whether it was a human or an AI that served that up to you, you were ultimately responsible. And I think that creates enough of a forcing function to get veterinarians realizing that they have, a weight to this. And I think what you're finding is, and this is a role I think of these associations that are now pushing back, radiology being kind of a prime example there, to say, hey guys, like, don't just press that was easy button. Understand that just because these companies exist, that doesn't decouple the responsibility that you ultimately have. And these are things that you need to be aware of, which is why you should be critically evaluating them. But I get really, I'm not concerned, but just like amused when people are like, oh, we're going to try to control the veterinary version of Claude. Like, just frankly, good luck. You know what I mean? Like, I think we have to really start to appreciate that we are a very small fish in a very big ocean. And we need to learn to live and work in a world in which these models are available to everybody and they are increasingly more capable, and really double down on the things that we think are most critical. But if it's protecting a particular task, I think it's going to be a really difficult battle, especially if in time that task proves to be done more efficiently, more accurately, more cost effectively as a result of AI owning.
So I think, Adam, I think the takeaway for our audience is one, the value proposition of listening to the Veterinary AI Brief, which is why we did a study, actually the smartest listener base of any podcast in the world, actually. So kudos to you, our listeners. But second, it is this idea of there is a forcing function for you being responsible. And what that means is you have to know what these models are set up to do well and what they're set up to not do well. And your judgment has never been more valuable. And I think, not only understanding the snapshot of kind of where the models are at right now, but the likely trajectory too. I think this is more relevant in software, but I think it'll be relevant in veterinary medicine as well. You can, there are companies who are building out systems that are basically support for what the models aren't good at, but are ultimately going to be able to do. But then there are companies who are really thinking through what compounds in value as the models get better and better. And it would be really interesting for our audience to really be thinking through, what is the thing that I can be doing that the models aren't likely going to eat that is actually going to get better and better. So going back in, Adam, you had shared in our group chat, which is very exclusive, very awesome, a paper from ChatGPT Health that I think really kind of illustrates this jagged frontier in how the audience can be thinking about what it's set up to do, what it's not set up to do. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of briefly mentioned it a minute ago, but basically, as far as I know, this was kind of the first research that was done specifically on the kind of accuracy of ChatGPT Health's recommendations. So just to kind of frame this up for people who are unfamiliar, ChatGPT released this health product. It's kind of a dedicated product within the OpenAI family. They have access to, through partnerships, a bunch of medical records. You can connect other data sources. And the idea is kind of like a health version of ChatGPT that's geared at patients in the human healthcare space. So it's not for vets, but or for pet owners. But I mean, You can imagine them doing something like that. And I think that there was a lot of excitement, but also concern about how this would shape, compete with, support the rest of the kind of healthcare system, right? And so this paper, and maybe a couple things about this paper that are worth sort of noting. So we talked about the length of time that research kind of takes to evolve and eventually get published. ChatGPT Health was released in January. This is now available. Like this is a very, very short time frame in order to produce research. And it gets back to my earlier comment about the muscle that needs to be developed to, as these releases occur, interrogate them and publish that research, as opposed to publishing something 2 years later and the model's completely out of date and it sort of um, dismisses a lot of the findings because they're like, I'm not using GPT 3.5 anymore anyway. So specifically in this, I'll just kind of throw it up on the screen. It's a paper in Nature. And basically what it said, a couple things that I want to highlight. They looked across 21 clinical domains and 16 different conditions, about 960 responses. These were clinician authored vignettes. So they basically have doctors sort of create scenarios. I think what's really interesting is it kind of followed this U-shaped pattern where for the most kind of emergency conditions, it was less accurate. And for like the non-urgent presentations. And obviously the one that's getting a lot of attention here is among the gold standard emergencies, about 52% of the cases were under triage. And what that practically means is you should have gone to the doctor earlier. This system was telling you that you could wait longer, which is obviously particularly challenging. They also talked about how when people minimized their symptoms, it ended up shifting the recommendations significantly in some edge cases. And so, people are looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, like, is this stuff ready for prime time? And I have a couple thoughts on this myself. I think one is this notion that we're going to like create the perfect AI that's always accurate and we have to like wait for that moment, like, is not a real thing. I think that we need to find ways to get this out and building it to be able to understand the limitations, the constraints, the gaps to help fuel innovation. And I think that this is a really healthy part of that process. The second part is that it's important to kind of anchor it a little bit to like, what is the expectations or the pathways that most people are going through right now? So one of the things that I always have a bit of trouble around is, okay, it's not as good as like this, the board certified specialists. And it's like, is that really where people are going for their first healthcare experience, or they're currently going to Google? And is this better than Google? I'm not saying that this is trust it with your life, though people actually are. But I think rightfully so, we have a very high bar in what we're testing these against. And I think that there's going to be a lot of examples of technology in the coming years where self-driving cars is another, like what's considered to be good enough, right? That we adopted en masse. And what is the right bar to hold this to? The third part is this then highlights areas for the companies to get better. They highlight the use cases they have to focus on, and they highlight to the healthcare community where the gaps are so that they can learn to properly use and reference these tools, whether it's with patients or clients, right? So we ran through this example even with Dr. Appleby again, when he was showing us ChatGPT is not very good if you just upload your pet's x-ray and ask it to analyze it, right? It sounds convincing. In some cases, many of the parts of it might be correct, but here are the areas where it falls down. People are going to use these tools. They're going to use them in ways that we don't necessarily like. They are going to have different experiences. It will never be everybody gets the same result. In one of my previous lectures, I showed just the difference between when you use a model like ChatGPT, 5.2 Pro versus the free version when you change the custom instructions, etc. on basic cases. It can vary wildly. And so yes, the models need to get better. Yes, we need to do this research, but we also have to appreciate that the entry point for how people are using these tools is going to look different. The way that they've configured and set up their personal instances is going to be different. The alternatives that they have are going to be different if you're in communities where you do not have access to specialists or you can't afford a specialist, etc. And so it's not so much like unleash dangerous AI everywhere, but the pace of improvement, I think, continues to accelerate as a result of this work. And I think we have to just be thoughtful about what the alternatives are as we look and compare them to the kind of like gold standards. But I think the takeaway here is that there's some areas that ChatGPT still is not very useful, or at least has some concerning areas, and I hope that they address them.
I think, the point you made around like the need for looking at this from like a relative instead of absolute perspective is a really good one. And I think like this has driven a lot of the reticence to use AI from the community is, somebody will have an experience with a model in the past. And because of that, they'll default to you can't trust AI to do this. And I think there are also voices out there, who are saying you can't trust AI or it's going to be communicating in these very non-nuanced kind of broad strokes ways that are actively putting people in a really important economic disadvantage. Because I think kind of tying all these threads together, what the core hypothesis is here is that the practices and the organizations who really understand what these models are set up to do well and where they're going are going to be at such a tremendous economic advantage relative to others that it really deserves a lot of focused attention. I actually think it would be really cool. I don't know if an audience member wants to vibe code slash agentic engineer this idea, but I think like there is a need for maybe like an artifact for veterinary practitioners to know like, hey, this is where the models are really, really good and this is where they're not so good. So they have almost like a checklist to fall back on and be thinking about it. Maybe it's a little more introductory, but seems like a cool cool gap to bridge there.
Well, I think maybe just one point on that. I think that this is where you're going to see different designs of the systems that help surface up and bubble up that transparency. So you're like, well, how do I know what the models are good at? One way in which you can start to visualize this is you build the VIN equivalent, but with AI agents and humans, right? Because it turns out it de- the answer is it depends. It depends on the context and the prompting and the model and the way that it frames it. But if you're having AI and humans working through a case really quickly, and you're upvoting the responses of the AI, and you're also seeing kind of that chain of thought, and veterinarians are able to kind of pick that up, you'll know very quickly where an AI is strong or weaker. You also can train AIs just to ask you questions, right? So screw if it's accurate on like a particular medical condition, help it refine your thinking process. Like this is where I think we think so one-dimensionally. People's mindset is I'm going to go away to a chat box, I'm going to give it my case information, and it's going to spit out an answer, and the answer is either going to be right or wrong, and if it's wrong, AI's back. Like that's not what's going to happen. That's not what is happening. There's veterinarians today that are building their own clinical decision support tools in Notebook LLM. They can buy all their past research, all their textbook chapters. They're building their own personal assistant and going very deep on what that assistant needs to do for them. And so I understand the risk and the challenges of having this kind of black box, here's a percentage answer, go with it. But I don't even think that's where the models and the experiences are today for a lot of people. Right. And so I think that fear is a little bit misguided, and it shows a lack of maybe creativity and how you're actually using these tools, because everything that I just shared is like possible today. And the leading users of these tools in our profession are already using it in that way. And so this is where I think it gets back to some of the research that Digital showed with AHA, which is that people's confidence and optimism in AI actually increases as they use it. Because if your experience has been limited to, I asked a shitty question in a free model 3 years ago to ChatGPT, and it said it was a foreign body and I knew it wasn't, you're doing yourself a disservice. And so that's where I think that we need to actually frame this, not necessarily from a safety perspective, though that is a consideration, but how do you just get more value out of this by having it act more as a thought partner, in the same way that if a veterinarian was just to kind of randomly stumble in your surgery and be like, there's a 30% chance that you're going to drop the pedicle and like walk out of the room, you'd be like, whoa, 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 like stop the presses. Like, can you give me some more information? Like, that's not how this works. You wouldn't necessarily even trust that thing, especially if they were coming just randomly. You didn't have an understanding of how they were trained, access to the data. You hadn't worked with them before. And so I just think that sort of transactional binary short responses is not the experience that A, people want, and B, where we're going to end up. And to see what the companies are actually trying to build. And Aaron, you might have some perspectives here about how you sort of have created that trust even within COVID. But I think these are the ability to design experiences that cultivate trust with veterinarians is going to be a critical accelerant to AI adoption. full stop. And I would like to see a diversity of ways in which that ends up being birthed, because I think we're still thinking way too narrowly about just the design of these experiences.
So I find it really fascinating just working with veterinarians over time and seeing how they are responding to these particular things. Like, for example, there was one veterinarian, I remember him talking about his clinic, and people who have not been around for a super long time won't remember the Amazon. Do you remember the Amazon Buy Now buttons?
Yeah.
Do you remember those? You could actually have like physical buttons that existed in a space and you would just tap it and it'd be next to your washing machine. And then 3 days later, you had, your clothes soap that was available for you. So this one veterinarian started hacking these and started saying, well, these things are free. So I'm just going to grab a whole bunch of them and started putting them all over the clinic. And then each one had a different message to each different person in the clinic. And so it streamlined the entire performance of everything that was happening around that clinic. So that kind of mindset is the exact same kind of mindset where you have people using Notebook LM, some of these other tools, building gems, that kind of stuff. But it's not the mindset of the masses. And the mindset of the masses is that people are willing to pay somebody in order to take care of all of that research and like figuring it out, problem solving. It's the same kind of person. Like, I don't want to become a mechanic. I just want a fixed car. Right. And so we're seeing this, I think the same thing happen in veterinary medicine, where, for example, we have a team of 8 veterinarians who every single time the new model is deployed, they're reviewing that model and figuring out what kind of results is it producing? Is this safe enough to push out to our customer base? And so you have people who are willing to pay the money in order to develop the trust that's required in order to use these tools. And so I just think, yes, there are going to be those people, but know who you are, right? If you're the type of person who just wants a well-running car, don't try to become a mechanic, right? Just pay somebody to do that work for you, figure out who's doing that work well, and get the results that you're looking for. If you want to play around, sure. And I think we should at some point probably develop a whole episode to understanding how to use Claude code appropriately. But maybe that's exactly where we need to think about, right? Is what are the types of people who are building these things? What kind of mindset do they have? The other people who just want a solution, they just want a product that is going to solve their problems. That's a different mindset. But I think it would be really interesting to start pulling in those people who are the builders for them to talk about their experiences.
So, I completely agree, and I would like for us to start discussing this now because I think there's just so like it is really an unlock once people start seeing what others are doing with it. But one disclaimer before we get there is something that I've been obsessed with Claude Code since December. I like honestly, I'm running 3 terminal sessions right now. Like and they're just building interesting things for me. The way that I find more leverage from Claude Code is actually as a thought partner more than just a builder. And one lesson that I've learned really bubbles up to what you guys have been talking about here, which is this idea of there is so little context that people are usually giving these models when they ask a question that is actually like living in their head. And because you're not giving it this context and teaching it what you actually want out of this experience, you're gonna get slop. And you're not gonna get what you want. The models have gotten so good over the last several months. And so OpenAI put out a paper recently called Harness Engineering, which is a super for any high achievers in the audience, fascinating read. And basically, they talked about the need to build the machine that builds the machine. So instead of jumping right to what you're building, you need to be thinking about like what are the necessary conditions for this model to
Yes.
deliver what I actually want. And I think that's such a critical point. So just an example of one thing that I'm working on that I think would be interesting for people to do is LLMs are fundamentally trained to please you and to make you want like what they tell you because this is the sycophancy problem, right? And so I can't tell you how many times Claude has told me just in the last couple hours, oh my God, that's the perfect question to be answering. It's not fucking not. I know it's not. I'm not that smart. Like,
What a novel insight.
yeah,
Thinking outside the box.
yeah. Like,
I'm
so
not bullshitting you.
exactly it. The better approach, I think, is to give it some guardrails to know what you actually need out of this instance. So, like, the way you can use the reason I really love Quad is part of the reason is you can build out subagents who have specific instructions and knowledge bases that then can contribute to a dialogue that you're having. So, me, what I'm looking for is rigorous thinking. I'm looking to figure out, like, when do I not have an idea fully baked? And that's sometimes hard to know. And the danger is when you really get how to use agentic engineering, you can go from zero to like a built working system pretty quickly. If you build on the wrong idea, though, it's not going to contribute the kind of value that you want. And so, what's interesting, and maybe this is interesting for different veterinary practitioners to be using it this way, is figure out how to program these different subagents with skills that aren't so much the cheerleaders, but are antagonists, right? So, like, almost like different colleagues with differing opinions, like how do you pull in some maybe insights from behavioral economics and just clear thinking and figure out like how to work through when an idea is not really there? And then if you combine like that type of rigor with an understanding of how to build, you can create a ton of leverage. Adam, I know you had you've been watching as Aaron and I have, as people are building out these really cool systems that are impacting the day to day. And I'd love to have our audience thinking before the next episode, like what are people actually building? What is this setting them up to do? Like what are the incredible unlocks that are available to anybody you know
Yeah, so maybe a quick plug for a tool that I've been having a lot of fun with, and then a call for our next episode. So there's a new platform by the name of Dreamer, and it was founded by one of the kind of ex leaders of Android. Think of it like a mobile app that builds mobile apps, basically. And certainly there's a lot of these that have been out there, but unlike like a Lovable or a Replit, it's really focused on dialing down the effort in order to get started. And so a lot of the kind of provisioning and setup and auth and all those things that might have required you to do some prompting or add those features. And it's really just like speak apps to an existence and build kind of mini apps around it. So as an example, one of the ones I built the other night was I wanted to find all the concerts and kind of keep track of them that are in my area in Squamish and to see this guy and be able to add them to a wish list and pull from different sites, and like it spun up the perfect app within like minutes. And like literally I bought concert tickets to acts that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to find. Really simple. And so this kind of rise of the personalized mini app I think is really interesting. We think of software, traditionally veterinary medicine is like third parties spending lots of time and lots of money to build a generic platform that I may or may not use that can fit into my practice management software system. But I think what's happening is this sort of bottoms up kind of organic creative energy from domain experts that now say, hey, that's all great. And those tools will hopefully get better. But I have like this really kind of sticky problem and things that I'm working on, or I'm sending a lot of emails in this way, or I'm constantly generating or reading this content. Like I just want to build something for myself. And I think the build it for yourself is a really interesting kind of new dimension of veterinary practice, because it turns out if you have that domain expertise, the tools are just getting better and better. And so you know what to build because you're ultimately the user of that tool. And you don't need it to be some massive mega app, and you don't need to spend a bunch of money. It can just be like, hey, I'm going to try this thing for 10 or 15 minutes. Um, and so with that being said, what we want to do is kind of put out a call to people in the veterinary space, ideally people that are in clinics, but anybody, to share the projects that they have built for themselves. All it needs to be is something that you're using frequently that you got value out of. And our goal is to hold an episode in the next kind of couple of weeks with 3 or 4 of these builders that can walk us through their process and sort of talk about some of these areas, how you think about the security and safety, how do you think about the data privacy, how you think about this kind of tension between building something for yourself versus making it available for your team versus making it available for the profession. How do you overcome maybe challenges in getting access to your PIMS data or other places? I think we're going to have a variety of different perspectives as a result of bringing some of those people on. And I can assure you, while early, some of that work is incredibly impressive. And some of the people that we're going to be able to speak to, I think, have really interesting kind of grounded perspectives and how the tools work today and what they want to see them do in the future. So if you are one of those people, send us an email, shoot us an example of what you've built, and we'd be happy to profile it and invite you on to speak about it.
I think what's blocking some people from building right now is imposter syndrome. And it's this belief that like I don't know how to, or maybe I couldn't build something that has value. And I think that is just so demonstrably false. And I want to talk a little bit about why. So Anthropic, we mentioned this in the intro to the episode. Anthropic held a hackathon. They had many people participate, a lot of software engineers, like people who have been building code for decades, right? And I think in the top 5, there was exactly one software engineer, and the rest were professionals with deep domain expertise and some specific point of view on a problem that they have. And the takeaway is these people built out production level systems because of this idea that what what AI really rewards is careful thinking. Like, if you can describe it, you can build it. There is no more code layer, basically. It's just thinking, it's figuring out, like, what is the thing that needs to exist? And how do I describe this in a way that the model can reliably do it? And so, what I think we're all just so collectively excited about is starting to get these stories out there in the public mind share that people are building valuable shit that is improving, clinical outcomes in all sorts of ways. And so we're going to do our part to kind of spotlight and elevate those stories. And we also just want to be doing more things that can empower people to start building as well, because we think like there's so much untapped genius in this profession, and we want to do our part in unblocking that and guiding wherever we can. So this has been an absolute pleasure. Adam, Aaron, and Robert signing off from the knee of the curve. We'll see y'all in a couple weeks. Happy building. Thanks, everyone.